Hey guys, so I am here for my first DuneTube video. DuneTube is a read-along of all 6 novels in Frank Herbert's Dune saga that is being hosted by Steve Donahue, Mark of Richardson Reads, Elena Macredina, and myself. We are reading one novel in the saga per month, starting this month with Dune, of course, and ending in December with Chapter House Dune. And Elena, Mark, and I are posting videos on the 20th of each month with our thoughts on the books. But Steve is doing something a bit different where he actually does an entire month-long read-along of each novel. And so he's already done a couple of videos on Dune, and I will leave links to those, and I highly recommend you go watch them because they've been wonderful. So, Dune. It is one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time. It is arguably the greatest science fiction novel of all time. I have not read enough science fiction to say that myself, but I certainly would not be inclined to disagree if someone said that. So Dune takes place many thousands of years in the future. Humanity has spread out across much of the known universe, and much of that universe that they have colonized is ruled over by an emperor, Emperor Shaddam IV. And this emperor rules using the power of his Sardaukar army. And the Sardaukar are this elite force of warriors who are essentially trained on a hell world called Seleucus Secundus. It's a special planet that's supposed to be just a hellhole to live in. And they're raised and trained on that planet to be the most deadly force of soldiers in the universe. They're nigh impossible to defeat, and so everyone lives in fear of this army that the Emperor has. Below the Emperor, there are a number of noble houses. They're also called great houses, who rule over individual planets. And the two most important noble houses for this story are the Harkonnens, and the Atreides. And the head of House Harkonnen at the beginning of this novel is Vladimir, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and the head of House Atreides is the Duke Leto Atreides. And I will return to those two in a minute. But for some further exposition, within the Empire there is also a sort of organization called the Spacing Guild. And they're a sort of organization, society, company. It's a little vague, but they're essentially a entirely male group who have a monopoly on space travel. Among the Spacing Guild, there are individuals called guild navigators who have the ability to see across long distances across the universe, and they can plot courses from one end of the universe to the other, however far they need to go. They are able to do this, they need to do this because if you didn't have the ability to see long distances across the universe in order to travel, then there's a chance that you would plot your course and essentially run yourself into a planet or into an asteroid. They can see far enough that they can plot a course that will not lead to danger like that. And they do this because, with special training, presumably, but also from consuming copious amounts of the spice melange. And the spice melange is essentially the resource on which the entire empire runs. It's a product that's found only on one planet, Arrakis, and Arrakis is entirely made up of desert. It's inhabited by giant sandworms who are bigger than any animal that has ever lived on Earth and can swallow spaceships whole. But anyway, the spice is harvested from Arrakis, and these navigators consume it in copious amounts. And it's not really known what other processes go into how these navigators get their abilities. And so the Spacing Guild has this monopoly on space travel, which makes them an incredibly important element in the Empire. And then the third, so there are sort of 3 major sources of power in the Empire. There's obviously the Emperor, who is presumably the head. There's the Spacing Guild, and then there's the Landsraad, which is a sort of council of great houses. And that also has some power. It's probably the least powerful of the 3. But at the beginning of Dune, we have the House Atreides, whose home planet of Caladan is a sort of paradise planet. It's like full of jungles and oceans and lakes. It's just a paradise. And Duke Leto has a concubine who is a sort of lover not an official wife and not his duchess, but a lover who is also the mother of his son and heir, Paul Atreides. And the Harkonnens are the arch enemies of the Atreides. They have been in a feud for a very long time, since a moment long ago when an Atreides military officer banished a Harkonnen, the head of House Harkonnen, for cowardice at an important battle in the history of the Empire. And they've been at each other's throats ever since. So, at the beginning of the novel, the Atreides are on their planet of Caladan, and the Harkonnens are in control of Arrakis, the planet with the spice. Now, they have partial control of Arrakis. It's not their home planet. They also have their home planet of Giedi Prime, which is their primary sort of capital base of operations, so to speak. But they also control Arrakis, and so they're in charge of harvesting the spice and keeping spice production up to acceptable standards. But at the beginning of Dune, what happens is the Emperor decides to have the Harkonnens leave Arrakis. They have been judged, presumably, to not be doing a good enough job keeping spice production up, and so they are removed, and the Atreides are put in charge of Arrakis, and they are given full control over Arrakis. So Arrakis has now become, in a sense, their homeworld. They're sent to Arrakis, so they can no longer live on Caladan. Duke Leto, and pretty much everyone, seems to know that this maneuver is actually a trap. The Emperor has begun to grow fearful of Leto Atreides, because Leto is gaining a lot of influence in Landsraad, in that Council of Great Houses, because of his charisma. And so that makes him threatening to the Emperor, but on top of that, Leto, it's implied later in the novel that Leto was also developing an army that could possibly rival the Sardaukar, because some of Leto's officers, Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck, are such great fighters that they seem like they could rival Sardaukar themselves. And so if those two, who seem to be equal to Sardaukar warriors, could train other warriors, and presumably Leto could create an army equal to the Sardaukar and threaten the Emperor's power that way as well. And so the Emperor feels threatened by Leto and wants to get rid of him. And then the Harkonnens, of course, have their long-standing feud with the Atreides. So the Emperor is sort of in league with the Harkonnens to take down Leto Atreides. And so they're once the Atreides are installed on Arrakis, the Harkonnens plan to basically have them destroyed surreptitiously with the Emperor's help. The Emperor can't openly support the Harkonnens' attack on the Atreides, which takes place during the novel, but he does surreptitiously supply some brigades of the Sardaukar, which makes the Harkonnens' army that much more deadly. And this sort of house-to-house warfare between two feuding houses is quite normal in the Empire, and it's actually tolerated. But the Emperor taking part of it is not usually tolerated, so the Emperor has to sort of do it secretly. But anyway, Leto and his wife, Jessica, or his concubine Jessica, know that this is a trap. And Jessica, to touch on her for a second, she is not just any woman. She is trained as a Bene Gesserit witch, as they're called. They're not usually, they're referred to in a derogatory sense as witches. They're not really officially called witches, but they're often referred to as Bene Gesserit witches. And the Bene Gesserit are another sort of society of all women who are trained to have extremely fine control over their bodies and minds. So, they can read other people really closely through their mannerisms and their tone of voice and such. They can almost read other people's minds. And on the other hand, they can control their own bodily functions, I suppose, but also just their muscles, their tone of voice and such, to an incredibly fine degree, to the point where they can actually sort of control people with their ability to control their own voice and to figure out what other people are thinking. And doing this is called using the voice, capital V. And so Jessica is incredibly intelligent, as you would imagine, and so she has seen that this is also a trap. And even Paul, whom Jessica has trained in the Bene Gesserit ways, is aware that this is basically a trap. So that is the beginning of this novel. And eventually, over the course of the first section of the novel, so the novel is divided into 3 parts. The first part is called Dune, the second part is called Muad'Dib, and the third is called The Prophet. So the first part, Dune, is mostly setting up all this scheming, with the culmination of the Harkonnen scheme against the Atreides. The Atreides are ousted, the Harkonnens attack Arrakis and throw them out, and the Duke Leto is killed, and Paul and Jessica escape into the desert. And that's the main part, that's the main event of the first section, Muad'Dib. The first section, which is called Dune. The second section, which is called Muad'Dib, is where Paul and Jessica come in contact with the Fremen. And the Fremen are the native inhabitants of Arrakis. And for centuries, they have been assumed to not be particularly interesting people. They've been thought to just be this sort of ragtag group of nomads who are relatively small in number, probably pretty primitive, and not much to worry about. But what Paul and Jessica find is an incredible level of cultural sophistication among the Fremen, and technological sophistication, because out in the desert, on this desert planet, you need to preserve as much water as possible inside of your body, because there's just no moisture on Arrakis. There's hardly any moisture. And so they've developed these advanced apparatus to wear through the desert called still suits, which basically keep water loss through sweat and such down to almost nothing, through catch tubes that are sort of attached to your body. It's kept a little bit vague how they work, but anyway, you just sort of don't think about it too much. It's a suit that preserves water, and the fact that they can come up with this sort of technology indicates a great level of technological sophistication. And on top of that, the Fremen are on Arrakis in much greater numbers than anyone had suspected, millions, whereas before they'd been thought to be perhaps in the hundreds of thousands only. But there are, in fact, millions of Fremen. And on top of all that, they also live on a really hostile planet where, it's a cutthroat culture where the leaders of each sort of tribe of the Fremen is the person with the greatest fighting ability, and anyone who is seen to show any sign of weakness is often left out to die in the desert. And so the Fremen have sort of unintentionally been fine-tuned into this supremely deadly fighting force. A fighting force just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the Sardaukar. And so Paul and Jessica come in contact with them, and what makes things sort of convenient for Paul is that there is this legend among the Fremen that someone called the Lisan al-Gaib, or the Mahdi, or which sort of translates as Messiah, will come and lead the Fremen to true freedom, and make Arrakis into this paradise planet that is full of jungle, kind of like Caladan. And they believe that Paul is that person, because there's supposed to be an off-worlder, there's supposed to be the son of a Bene Gesserit, and there's all these other aspects to the prophecy that Paul fulfills. And Paul himself is a very charismatic guy. He's very young at the beginning of the novel, but by the end he has sort of come of age and become this hardened leader. And he himself is very charismatic and is really good at commanding people's loyalty, as Leto was. Leto, in fact, in this reading of the novel, what struck me the most was Leto's character. I had never sort of been struck by Leto too much, but this time I really saw how Leto was such a seductive leader. Because there's this one great moment where he risks the life of his own son to save soldiers. He refuses to leave behind some soldiers, or not soldiers, but workers on a spice farming ship out in the desert. He refuses to leave anyone behind when that ship is about to be enveloped by a sandworm, and the carryall that's supposed to carry it to safety if a worm comes doesn't come. Leto refuses to leave anyone behind and risks his own and his son's life for it. And I can see how that Leto is such a seductive leader in that sense, and Paul is as well, in a bit of a different way. But anyway, with time, Paul sort of gains influence among the Fremen. He becomes one of them, in a sense. His mother becomes a reverend mother among the Fremen, which is sort of exalted position, often held by someone with Bene Gesserit-like abilities. And the Fremen's certainty in Paul's status as their Mahdi becomes ever more solidified, and essentially he decides to lead the Fremen as, you know, his own fighting force to you know, in turn oust the Harkonnens. And on top of that, he ends up toppling the Emperor. Because what Paul has sort of figured out something that no one else really knows, because no one cares enough to investigate it, but he has figured out how the spice works. And he's figured out that it's the sandworms who create the spice. No one really seems to know that the sandworms are the ones who actually create the spice. And he's also figured out how to essentially destroy the spice. It's a bit complicated, but if you drown a worm that's in its infancy, that's only, like, you know, the size of like a large snake, if you drown it, it essentially vomits up water called the water of life. And this water, if you mix it with a spice cache on Arrakis, a spice field, it will start a chain reaction that essentially would destroy all spice production and all worms as well. And Paul figures this out and essentially holds Arrakis hostage in that way to the Emperor himself, and says, you have to stand down, and you have to make me Emperor and let me marry your daughter, the Emperor's daughter, or else I will essentially do something that will end civilization. And so, you know, the Emperor is the one who blinks first, and he stands down, and at the end of this, Paul is sort of the master of Arrakis and the master of the universe, essentially. And it's implied at the end of this that the Fremen, who regard him as this messiah figure, will go forth into the universe to conquer, and will, you know, spread destruction and death across the entire universe. But yeah, so anyway, I've done an inadequate job of summarizing this novel. It's a difficult novel to talk about, especially in just one video. Steve actually made this point in some Voxer messages and in his own videos on the subject, that talking about Dune for only one video is kind of unsatisfactory, because, you know, you have all the exposition. You know, this is an incredibly alien world. You know, this universe that Frank Herbert created, it was one of the great feats of world building in a science fiction or fantasy novel or series. And it's so alien and different, and he doesn't hold your hand at all. You are just thrown right in, and people start throwing weird words at you and weird phrases and talking about, you know, complex politics and secret organizations and plots and such, and secret breeding programs and all that stuff, and none of it is explained explicitly. You kind of have to connect the pieces yourself. There is, in this edition at least, there is a glossary in the back. But that will only get you so far. So there's that, there's all the thematic complexity of this novel. I mean, there are so many different levels on which this novel is working. I mean, it just looks at so many different themes. I mean, you can, the one that resonates with me the most is this idea of Paul as a messiah and as a charismatic leader, and the dangers of following a charismatic leader, which I think seems to be the aspect of it that Frank Herbert was focusing on the most. But on top of that, you know, I jotted down a bunch of the themes in my notes, and there's the ideas of a monopoly. You know, that Space and Guild has a monopoly, and how fragile monopolies are. You can even look at the Emperor with his Sardaukar, and that in a sense is a monopoly on military might. But and that is both a strength of the Emperor, but also a weakness, because as soon as that monopoly is broken, then basically everything comes crashing down around the Emperor's head, because he no longer has military dominance. He realizes that in the climactic battle in the book, and so once that comes crashing down, he is left with nothing. And same thing with the Spacing Guild. It has a monopoly on transportation, but it also is completely dependent on the spice. So as soon as Paul gains control of the spice, they essentially can't do anything anymore. You can look at sort of how dangerous the coupling of religion and government is. You know, Paul is a messiah, a religious messiah. You know, one of the titles of one of the ways of referring to him in terms of the prophecy that the Fremen have is as the friend of God. So that's a pretty powerful position. And to the kind of unquestioning allegiance that leads to. You know, you can look at environmentalism and how this novel explores how the environment affects the development of cultures. So the sort of idea of environmental anthropology, in a sense. Because you look at the Fremen and how their culture is completely centered on water. Because Arrakis has so little water, has almost no water on it. Again, the still suits that they developed were developed for that. And water is a mark of wealth on Arrakis among the Fremen. You know, there are actual, like, they have these sort of pieces of jewelry that they carry around that show how much water someone possesses, how much excess water someone possesses beyond their own water that they need to sustain their body. And that is a marker of wealth, having a lot of water. So there's just so much thematic complexity in Dune that talking about it in one video is, like, almost inadequate. And, you know, I myself have fallen prey to that. I am not going to do it justice at all. I'm inevitably going to be dissatisfied with this video and what I talked about, because I'm always going to be thinking, oh, I forgot to talk about so-and-so, you know? I would really be interested to hear what about this novel struck all of you who read it with us. I mean, especially those of you who read it for the first time. How did you like it? How did you get along with it? I mean, did the complexity of the world building sort of do you in? Was it too much for you? Were you seduced by Paul and the Atreides, or not? You know, what did you think of all the other many themes attached to it? Which ones did you find the most interesting? Yeah, let's have a conversation down in the comments about this, because I'm not going to be able to do it justice in this video. But anyway, yeah. So I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to seeing other videos on DuneTube. Anyway, I hope you'll all join us next month for Dune Messiah. We'll be making our videos yet again on the 20th of the month. August is the month. And yeah, Dune Messiah is unfortunately considered the weakest novel in the Dune saga, and I've read 3 of the novels, and I, as it stands, have to agree with that assessment, so it's a bit unfortunate, but anyway, we will get through it, and we will get what we can out of Dune Messiah. So anyway, give me your thoughts in the comments, and I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend, and I'll talk to you later. Bye, guys.